The year is 2001.
The latest video game war is heating up tonight. Nintendo's GameCube system is about to hit the stores.
Lined up as early as noon today just to be the first inside the Soho nightclub.
We're just waiting for the GameCube to come out. Everybody's so anxious to play with it and everything.
I remember it well. America is barely 2 months out from September 11th.
Looks like it has crashed into probably 20 stories from the top of the World Trade Center.
Our economy is shaken. The country is grieving. The holidays feel a little different this year. And yet, outside of game stores across the country, there are lines. November 18th, 2001. Kids in puffy coats, breath fogging in the November air, fidgeting. Parents checking their watches. Teenagers who've been theorizing about this thing for months. On forums, on GameFAQs, and playground arguments, finally getting to put their money where their mouth is. Nintendo is about to launch the GameCube. And almost nobody is ready for how weird it's gonna be. This isn't just another console launch. Nintendo is in trouble. Real trouble.
In short, Nintendo took the power of a $100,000 computer and put it into an affordable home game machine.
The N64 only sold around 33 million units. The PlayStation sold 102 million. Nintendo had gone from owning the living room to being a very talented runner-up.
Will you be the one to witness the birth of the incredible Nintendo Entertainment System?
Only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power.
And now they're walking into a fight against not one, but two enormous rivals. Sony's PlayStation 2 has already been on shelves for over a year. Microsoft, the Windows people, have somehow thrown their hat into the gaming ring and are bringing this thing called the Xbox.
And I'm not one of those game guys that gets like totally absorbed, you know? Taste it! Yeah! You're going down!
And what does Nintendo have against the might of Microsoft and the overwhelming victory that Sony dealt them? A purple cube with a handle. A lunchbox. Gaming journalists in 2001 were not kind about this. The internet was younger then, but it was still very capable of being absolutely savage about Nintendo's design choices. The mockery was immediate. The lunchbox, the toy, the Kiddie Console. And you know what? Those people were wrong. Historically, embarrassingly wrong. Not about the commercial reality, of course, they were right about that, but about what actually mattered. And I've been saying this since the show launched in 2002. Because what Nintendo put inside that purple lunchbox, the games they built for it, the ideas they tested with it, the entire generation of developers they shaped through it, turned out to be some of the most important work in gaming history. The GameCube didn't win its generation, but it may have been the best console of its generation. And today, we're gonna prove it. For most of the 80s and the early 90s, Nintendo wasn't just winning the console wars, Nintendo was the console wars. The NES had essentially single-handedly revived an industry that had crashed and burned in 1983. The SNES was the gold standard of gaming. If you wanted to play video games, real video games, you played Nintendo. The rivalry with Sega happened, and we had a nick in their armor, but then Sony happened. They were supposed to be Nintendo's partner. Nintendo had commissioned Sony to build a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo, the PlayStation. The deal fell apart in 1991 in one of the most spectacular corporate betrayals in tech history. Nintendo announced they were going with Philips instead at CES the day after Sony had showcased their product. Sony did not forgive this.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Pack up your stuff. I got a little surprise for you here.
Check it out. What do you think about that? We got real-time, 3D, lush organic environments. How's that make you feel, buddy?
Feel a little like your days are numbered?
I'm going to have to ask you to leave.
You're hurting my elbow.
Is that Italian?
No, Bandicoot. It's an Australian name.
They launched their own console in 1994 and proceeded to absolutely dismantle Nintendo's home console dominance over the following decade. The PlayStation hit absolutely every note that Nintendo had fumbled. It used CDs instead of cartridges, cheaper to produce, cheaper for developers, way more storage. It courted third-party publishers aggressively, giving them tools, support, and a rapidly growing install base. And it understood the audience that Nintendo didn't. Young adults who wanted games that felt edgy, cinematic, and cool. The N64 launched in 1996 and was genuinely a technological marvel. The hardware was extraordinary for its time, coming from Silicon Graphics. Super Mario 64 redefined 3D platforming. Ocarina of Time is still considered by many to be the greatest game ever made, but they made one catastrophic decision. They stuck with cartridges in 1996. While the entire industry had moved to CDs. The reasoning wasn't stupid. Cartridges loaded instantly, no waiting. They were harder to pirate, and Nintendo had built their entire ecosystem around them. You see, video game companies make money not on the consoles sold, but on the licensing that happens with the games. And in that, Nintendo completely dominated cartridges. CDs were locked in with Sony's technology. A PlayStation CD might cost 50 cents to manufacture, an N64 cartridge could cost $15 to $20. Publishers had to price Nintendo 64 games higher and accept lower margins, and they had less storage, meaning complex games had to cut content. Squaresoft, one of Nintendo's most important longtime partners, looked at the N64 cartridge situation and made a decision. They were taking their most anticipated RPG of the decade to PlayStation instead. The Final Fantasy VII PlayStation commercials, elaborate CG cutscenes, massive worlds, cinematic scope looked nothing like anything that existed on cartridge.
More than 200 animators and programmers. A multi-million-dollar production. Over 2 years in the making. And a cast of thousands. They said it couldn't be done in a major motion picture. They were right. Final Fantasy VII.
That was the point. That was the announcement. This is what CDs make possible, and you can only get it on PlayStation. By the end of the N64 era, the numbers told the story clearly. PlayStation had moved 102 million units. The N64, 33 million. The SNES had outsold the Sega Genesis, but the N64 had not beaten the PlayStation. For the first time in Nintendo's console history, they had lost. So what do you do when you're Nintendo? It's 1998, you just watched Sony crush you for an entire generation. Microsoft is literally showing up to the console space with basically infinite money. So you build something called Project Dolphin. That was the code name for what would become the GameCube, chosen as far as anyone can tell because dolphins are clever and sleek, and Nintendo engineers apparently liked the name. The online gaming initiative Nintendo was working on in parallel was also called Dolphin for a while, which was confusing, but Nintendo has never been a company deeply concerned with whether their internal naming conventions made sense to outsiders. The first decision that they absolutely got right was to drop cartridges. Finally, done. No more cartridges. For the GameCube, Nintendo was going optical. But here's where they got stubborn, or creative, depending on how you look at it. Sony was using standard DVDs. Microsoft was going to use standard DVDs. Nintendo looked at this decision and decided, we're going to use our own proprietary mini-disc format. An 8-centimeter disc instead of a standard 12-centimeter. There were reasons. The smaller drive mechanism cost less, the disc had a distinctive identity, it looked cool, and 1.5 gigabytes, according to Nintendo, was enough for games, which was mostly true. Most GameCube games fit beautifully. Some didn't, and that became a problem. The bigger and more controversial call was DVD movie playback. The PS2 launched in 2000, and in a lot of markets, it was literally cheaper to buy a PlayStation 2 than a standalone DVD player. Sony was essentially selling a DVD player that also played incredible games. It was brilliant. It put the PlayStation 2 into homes that might not otherwise have bought a game console and set sales records still not defeated. But Nintendo said no. We are a game machine. We make games. We play games. We are not a DVD player. This is very admirable, but also self-defeating, and it's the most Nintendo decision in Nintendo history, of many Nintendo decisions. For the processor, they built a custom PowerPC-based CPU they called Gecko. For graphics, they partnered with a company called ArtX founded by former engineers from Silicon Graphics, the same folks that had brought us the N64 graphics chip. While the GameCube was in development, ATI acquired ArtX, meaning Nintendo ended up with an ATI GPU by accident. They called it Flipper. They're pretty interesting chips. Kenichiro Ishida led the design of the GameCube with the then newly promoted executive Satoru Iwata. The design of the GameCube was essentially, it should be fun to look at, compact enough to carry, and obviously Nintendo. They succeeded wildly on all these counts. The GameCube at 150 millimeters cubed was tiny, genuinely small for what was inside it. The handle was functional. Nintendo literally expected people to bring their consoles to friends' houses. Now this brings us to the launch. September 14th, 2001, Japan got the GameCube first. Then in November 18th, North America, the system lands $100 cheaper than the Xbox and matching the PS2 after Sony had already cut their price. Nintendo, for once, is competitive on price. In fact, the GameCube is actually profitable at launch. Nintendo makes money on each unit sold, which in the console industry is genuinely unusual, as I mentioned before, and speaks to how thoughtfully they manage their component costs. The launch lineup, I think, is great. A lot of folks at the time said it was a little thin. The flagship title was not a Mario game. It wasn't a Zelda game. It was Luigi's Mansion. Luigi, the green one, the nervous one, the cowardly younger brother who has literally never once been the main character of anything. That guy. That was Nintendo's hype machine for the GameCube. And you know what? Luigi's Mansion is awesome. It's genuinely great. It is a charming, inventive, technically impressive haunted house game when you vacuum up ghosts with a modified leaf blower. The lighting alone, more advanced than anything on the PS2 at launch. It just wasn't exactly a system-selling statement, unfortunately. What was a system-selling statement was Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader. This was from Factor 5. It was a Star Wars flight game. You're flying X-Wings, Y-Wings, from the Battle of Yavin to the Battle of Hoth, and it looked good. In fact, it still looks good. Look at this. This looks like it could almost have come out today. It looks amazing. Factor 5 had squeezed something extraordinary out of the new hardware right at launch. And Smash Bros. Melee, which comes out just a little bit later, extends the console past its generation and is one of the most remarkable releases in competitive gaming history. Our first weekend in North America, approximately 500,000 units. Solid, strong, but here's the problem. Sony's PlayStation 2 had launched 13 months earlier. 13 months. The PS2 had Grand Theft Auto 3, it had Metal Gear Solid 2, Final Fantasy X was just out. The install base was enormous. The software library was rich, and the cultural conversion was already happening on the PS2. The GameCube was arriving late to a party that had started a year ago. By the end of its run, the GameCube would sell 21.74 million units worldwide. The PS2 would sell 155 million. The Xbox would even beat it out at 24 million. For the first time in Nintendo's history of home consoles, they finished third. The company that saved gaming in the United States in 1983 comes out third. But as I said, sales numbers are not the whole story. It's not even the most interesting story with the GameCube. Because what happened inside that purple lunchbox between 2001 and 2007 was extraordinary. And that's where we're going next. The GameCube was extraordinary. The processor was called the Gecko, designed by IBM based on the PowerPC architecture. It ran at 485 megahertz. Now, if you compare that to the competition, the Xbox ran at 733 megahertz, while you have Sony's 294 megahertz Emotion engine. This puts the Gecko kind of middle of the road, but clock speed comparisons are almost always misleading. IBM built the Gecko on something called silicon on insulator technology, 180 nanometer SOI, which was genuinely cutting-edge manufacturing at the time. The real-world performance was well above the 485 megahertz would suggest. There's also a feature called paired single SIMD, single instruction, multiple data. It's a type of instruction that lets the CPU perform two floating point calculations at the exact same time. For 3D graphics, floating point math is basically everything. Position, rotation, lighting, calculation, physics. Doubling your floating point throughput isn't a minor improvement. Developers who knew how to exploit it, and some did, got significantly more performance out of the Gecko than the headline numbers implied. Now this is what's really special here. The GPU, Flipper, ran at 162 megahertz. Again, numbers that don't sound impressive until you dig into what was actually inside this thing. Flipper contained 3 megabytes of what's called embedded 1T SRAM, ETRAM, right on the same die as the GPU itself. This was a memory technology licensed from a company called MoSys, and it was exotic and expensive. 1 transistor SRAM offers bandwidth that regular DRAM simply can't match. That 3 megabytes of ETRAM operated at 10.4 gigabytes per second. 10.4. For context, the main system memory ran at 2.6 gigabytes per second. Reading texture data is the bottleneck. By solving the bottleneck with on-die, ultra-fast cache, the GameCube's GPU could produce images that were cleaner, sharper, and better filtered than what competitors could manage with raw theoretical power. The second magic ingredient in Flipper is something called the TEV, the Texture Environment Unit. This was a hardware system that allowed up to 6 stages of per pixel color combining, 16 stages. Each stage can take texture data, blend it with color, adjust alpha, combine it with the previous stage's output. It sounds abstract, but what it meant was developers who truly understood the TEV could produce visual effects that had no right to look as good as they did on this 162 megahertz chip. The Metroid Prime games are the prime example. The way light refracts through Samus's visor in rain, the glow of lava reflected in polished surfaces, the translucency of ice, environmental effects that players would look at and genuinely wonder, how is this running on a GameCube? The answer? Retro Studios had a team that understood the TEV at a deeply technical level and used it to simulate effects that would normally require programmable shaders. The GameCube couldn't do everything the Xbox could do graphically, but in the right hands, it could produce things the Xbox couldn't and make them look better. One of the most widely accepted controllers in gaming history. Just kidding. The GameCube controller is one of the most polarizing objects in gaming hardware history since, well, the N64 controller. And I love it. I do. It's still one of the most comfortable controllers I've ever felt to this day. Look at the face buttons. The A button is enormous. It takes up the center of the face, clearly the primary button. B is smaller, tucked below and left. X and Y are smaller still, off to the side. This is not an accident. This is a philosophy. Most Nintendo games are built around 1 or 2 primary actions: jump, attack, interact. The A button is that action. Making it bigger is communicating that hierarchy physically with your thumb. You always know where A is because it's the big one. Every PlayStation and Xbox controller treats all 4 face buttons as equals. Same size, arranged in a diamond. That's neutral. It says all actions are equivalent. Nintendo's controller says, we've thought about which actions matter most, and we've made that a little easier for you. The analog triggers are dual stage. You can apply variable pressure for analog input, and then push all the way for a digital click at the bottom. Games like F-Zero GX use this for braking intensity. Sunshine used it for water flow rate. It's clever hardware design used cleverly by clever developers. The C-Stick, the second analog stick, smaller, yellow, off to the right, is controversial. It's smaller than the primary stick, which caused problems for any game designed around equal dual-stick control. First-person shooters, in particular, felt awkward, and this is the controller's genuine weakness. It was designed for the games Nintendo made, not the games Western publishers were making. The GameCube controller is an amazing example of Nintendo design. Brilliant for everything Nintendo does, suboptimal for everything they don't. Now, the GameCube did have weaknesses. It had 24 megabytes of main RAM, fast, clever 1T SRAM, but 24 megabytes. The Xbox had 64. This mattered for complex, asset-heavy games. It didn't matter as much for tight, focused Nintendo first-party titles. PlayStation 2 is the best-selling home console of all time. Still, 155 million units. That's not a win, that's a rout. That's one console selling more than every other console of its generation combined, with room to spare. Technically, the PS2 is an interesting story because it was actually quite difficult to program. I've actually heard developers say it took them a year at points just to get something to move across the screen. The Emotion Engine, Sony's custom CPU, had this parallel architecture with 2 vector units that could do incredible geometry processing, but only if you knew exactly how to feed them data in the right sequence. Early PS2 games looked mediocre, not because the hardware was weak, but because no one had figured it out yet. The GameCube, by comparison, was considered a pleasure to develop for, the complete opposite of the N64. Developers could get polished results quickly and easily, which really showed on Rogue Leader. In cross-platform comparisons, the same game on PS2 and GameCube, the GameCube frequently looked better. Sharper textures, better anti-aliasing, cleaner frame rate. The PS2 version might actually have more polygons on screen, but the GameCube version looked less muddy, less jaggy, more like what the artist had intended. But the PS2 had 4,000 games. 4,000. The GameCube had about 600. When you have a library that size, you can afford to have great games in every genre for every audience at every price point. The GameCube simply couldn't compete on breadth. Its depth was extraordinary, its breadth was not. Microsoft's Xbox is one of the most audacious product launches in the history of gaming. A company that made operating systems and office software decided, very rationally as it turned out, that the living room was the next battleground for computing, and they were not going to cede it to Sony. So they built a console, and they didn't mess around. The Xbox had a 733 megahertz Intel CPU and an NVIDIA NV2A GPU derived from the GeForce 3. In raw numbers, it was the most powerful console of the generation. It had 64 megabytes of unified memory. It had an 8 gigabyte hard drive. It could rip CDs to the hard drive and use music as custom soundtracks and games. By 2001 standards, this thing was luxurious. The NVIDIA GPU supported DirectX 8 class programmable shaders. This is genuinely significant. Programmable shaders are what allowed developers to write custom code for how the GPU renders each pixel. The GameCube's flipper chip couldn't do this in the same way. Its TEV system was fixed function, just extremely flexible. The Xbox could do things graphically that the GameCube and the PS2 simply could not. Certain lighting and visual effects were architecturally impossible on Flipper. Halo's environments, the reflection effects, the particle systems, these were things GameCube developers had to approximate or skip. The Xbox didn't just have better hardware than the GameCube, it had different hardware, a different paradigm of how graphics should work. But the Xbox's nuclear weapon wasn't the hardware. It was Xbox Live. Launched in November 2002, Xbox Live was the first unified gaming service for a home console. You paid $50 a year, you got a gamer tag, you got a friends list, you got matchmaking, you got voice chat with a headset that came in the box. And then Halo 2 came along in 2004 and put 1 million people online simultaneously playing the same game, and the world changed. The GameCube's response to all this was a broadband adapter that maybe 3% of owners ever bought, and Phantasy Star Online, which again was great, but not a response. Nintendo's position was, our audience doesn't want this. Our audience wants to play games on their couch with their friends in the same room. Local multiplayer is the Nintendo ethos. They were right about their audience in 2001. They were catastrophically wrong about where gaming was going, though. And the cultural association between Microsoft and online console gaming that formed in this era has never fully dissolved, even as Nintendo caught up decades later. Although Microsoft might be working to dissolve that right now. The GameCube was also damaged by the story people told about it. Gaming media in the early 2000s was in the process of growing up, or at least growing older. The audience was aging, the culture was shifting towards treating games as serious entertainment for serious adults. GTA 3 was proof that games could be transgressive and cinematic and morally complex. Metal Gear Solid 2 was proof they could be impenetrably philosophical. Xbox's marketing was all edge and power and testosterone. And Nintendo showed up with a purple cube and a game where you vacuum up cartoon ghosts, with a cartoon character named Luigi. The narrative that the GameCube was for kids became self-reinforcing. Media coverage assumed it. Consumers internalized it. Third parties deprioritized the platform because of it. And the reality that this kids' console hosted Resident Evil 4, the most influential game of the decade, got largely lost in the noise. Ironically, it was this experience that ultimately forced Nintendo to do some of their best thinking. And the GameCube had some of my favorite games of all time. Super Smash Bros. Melee. This game was developed in only 13 months, an insanely short development cycle for a major first-party Nintendo game. Masahiro Sakurai and his team at HAL Laboratory were essentially speedrunning the development of a sequel, working to make the GameCube launch in Japan. They added characters, they added stages, they built a robust single-player adventure mode, and they released the game. Didn't quite make the launch window, but they built something they didn't intend, one of the deepest competitive fighting games ever created. There's so much about Melee that we could talk about that makes it amazing, but I think the most endearing is that Nintendo still sells GameCube-compatible controllers in 2026. Until the Switch 2 released GameCube compatibility, this was because of Melee. The game created a demand for its own hardware that has even outshined the platform by 2 decades. There's no other example of this in gaming history. Oh, Metroid Prime. Retro Studios, based in Austin, Texas, was in complete chaos when Nintendo first acquired them. Multiple projects had been canceled, staff was leaving, the studio was essentially a disaster. Nintendo could have written them off. Instead, Shigeru Miyamoto gave them a brief that most developers would have considered a poison chalice. Take Metroid, a beloved franchise dormant for 8 years, and reinvent it in 3 dimensions. First-person perspective, no dialogue for Samus, no map markers showing you where to go. keep the spirit of exploration and mystery that made Super Metroid a masterpiece while doing something completely new with it. The gaming internet of 2001 was not enthusiastic. First-person Metroid from a studio nobody had ever heard of, made in America? The skepticism was volcanic. Metroid Prime was reviewed at a 97 out of 100 on Metacritic. It is one of the highest rated games ever made. The skeptics were wrong, just as they were wrong about much of the GameCube. Oh my gosh, the Wind Waker. I spent so much time on the internet defending the GameCube, and probably the most of that time was defending Wind Waker. At the Space World event in 2000, they showed a brief tech demo of a realistic, high-polygon Link fighting a realistic Ganon. It was breathtaking. The internet lost its mind. Zelda fans started counting down the days to a realistic, cinematic, adult Zelda experience on GameCube. Then, in 2001, Nintendo showed what the actual GameCube Zelda looked like. Cell-shaded, huge eyes, cartoonish proportions, bright colors. Link looked approximately 8 years old. The reaction was intense. The phrase cartoon Zelda was not used kindly. There was a petition, an actual online petition demanding Nintendo change the art style. The term Zelda emerged as a disparaging nickname. And then the game came out, and everyone who signed the petition had to go find a very large hat to eat. The game is amazing. Link in Wind Waker communicates more emotion through his enormous eyes than any realistic game character of that era. When he's scared, you see it. When he's determined, you see it. When he's heartbroken and there are moments in the game that will genuinely hit you, you will see it on his face in a way that photorealistic graphics cannot yet produce. The game is also poignant in a way that surprised everyone. It has an ocean, a vast, real open ocean that you sail across in a boat with real weather, real wind, real dawn, and dusk. The game is melancholy in the best way, about a lost world, ancient legends, the weight of being a hero when the age of heroes is over. The ending hit harder than anyone expected from a cartoon game. Was it perfect? No. Nintendo cut dungeons to make a release date, and the second half of the game feels rushed compared to the first. However, rushed endings and all, this game belongs among the finest games Nintendo ever made. Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 is potentially the most influential game of the 2000s. You can debate individual games' qualities endlessly, but in terms of lasting impact on how games are designed, how they control, how they balance action and tension, how they structure their environments, Resident Evil 4 changed almost everything downstream from it. It started as a GameCube exclusive, part of a deal between Capcom and Nintendo that brought several Resident Evil titles to the platform. A complete rebuild of original Resident Evil 1 in the GameCube engine remains one of the greatest survival horror games ever made. Resident Evil 0 was a GameCube exclusive, and Resident Evil 4 was supposed to be. What Shinji Mikami and his team built was something the series hadn't attempted before. An over-the-shoulder, third-person action game with survival horror sensibilities. Fixed camera angles were gone. Tank controls were gone. In their place, a tight camera behind Leon's shoulder, aiming with the right stick, environment-aware enemy AI that flanked you and communicated with each other and adapted to your tactics. Every third-person action game after Resident Evil 4 is either influenced by Resident Evil 4 or explicitly reacting against it. Dead Space, Uncharted, The Last of Us, Mass Effect, Gears of War, all of them. And then, before the GameCube version had even launched in Japan, Capcom announced a PS2 port. The outrage from GameCube owners was immediate and completely understandable, but in retrospect, Resident Evil 4 being on everything was the right outcome for the game. It's too important to have stayed an exclusive. It needed to be everywhere. Now there's tons of games I could mention here. F-Zero GX, Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, Silicon Knights GameCube exclusive psychological horror game which used a sanity system that tracked your character's mental state, and then, I want you to really appreciate this, pretended to delete your save file when your sanity got low. As in, you'd see the deleting save data screen, your heart would stop, and then it would go, lol, no, in 2002. This was happening in 2002. Tales of Symphonia, Pikmin, it's Pikmin. Shigeru Miyamoto's late career masterwork, commanding armies of tiny creature with a leaf on their head, solving environmental puzzles with living tools, genuinely stressful, genuinely charming, genuinely like nothing else. Animal Crossing. Such a great cozy game. Super Mario Sunshine, maligned at launch, reappraised as a charming oddity, and increasingly recognized as a game with deeper water mechanics and tighter platforming than it was ever given credit for. Isle Delfino is one of the most evocative game worlds Nintendo ever built. The GameCube library is the definition of quality over quantity. Fewer games than the competition, but those peaks are Mount Everest. Which brings us back to the GameCube launch. This amazing system was a system that I was incredibly excited for. I was in high school, and of course, a huge gamer since I played the NES back in the mid-'80s. But I'd fallen off of Nintendo a little bit. I loved a few of the games on the N64. Super Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, Star Fox 64. Hell, I loved NBA Hang Time on it with its quick load times. But there was something about the N64 that just didn't quite live up to the other Nintendo systems for me. But it got rejuvenated for the GameCube. As you do in high school, I started being forced to do research papers, and I wanted to do something that I was really interested in. So I decided to go with video games. And I read many books about video game history at the time. Game Over, Press Start to Continue was one of my favorites, and basically anything I could get my hands on. And what I found with Nintendo was a company way more interesting than I could ever have imagined. A company going back to the 1800s. A company that took a wild chance in the 80s with an industry that had been decimated and basically doomed to death, and brought out a console that is still my favorite of all time. In doing this research, of course, I discovered a lot of information about Shigeru Miyamoto, and he became one of my absolute heroes, and is to this day. And in writing all these papers, I was actually hyping myself up for the GameCube. I started looking at, well, what is Nintendo doing next? And the GameCube, to me, really seemed like a return to form. I loved reading the magazines about the technology of the console coming out. I loved reading about how their focus was games. It wasn't on DVD players and all sorts of external things. It was just on making great games. And potentially after a one-off system that hadn't won the generation like the previous Nintendo consoles, they were going to return to their former glory. And I truly believed it. So when the GameCube came out, November 18th, 2001, I was as excited as you could possibly imagine. I can still remember that glorious morning. My girlfriend and I, now wife, planned it out. We went to the Target at 5 a.m. There was no pre-ordering. You couldn't pre-order the thing, at least in my area. So we made a bunch of coffee. We went out and we camped out in my car. We camped out with Richie, who would later go on to host the game show with me. And we later stood in line. I remember there was an Xbox guy there that was super stoked for the Xbox. And at the time, I just couldn't imagine anyone picking an Xbox over the GameCube. This was Nintendo. Of course, I hadn't really played Halo yet. I didn't really understand the whole thing. I was actually a Microsoft fan at the time. I really liked Windows over Mac. So I was predisposed to liking the Xbox. What I didn't like at the time was the philosophy behind PC games. I just like console games better. I like their polish. I like their ease. I like the focus of just jumping in and playing a game. And I tended to like the games that were made exclusively for consoles better. So what I didn't want was every game to become like a PC game, which was what I thought Microsoft intended. Kind of lure console gamers in, and then eventually make the line between PC and console games basically non-existent, which is what happened in 2026. But hey, it's a little different than I predicted, and I actually support it now that all console games besides Nintendo's are pretty much the same. It makes sense. So while I feared it before, now it seems like a logical conclusion to where we're at. That morning, November 18th, 2001, waiting in line, running through the Target with my girlfriend, getting told not to run, but still running, grabbing a purple GameCube. I wanted the one that Miyamoto held up at E3. Grabbing Luigi's Mansion, Super Monkey Ball, Star Wars, Rogue Leader, and coming home, hiding so I didn't have to go to church with my family that day. Hopefully I'm forgiven for that. And turning it on and hearing this. This console was my passion of that generation. A console that I feverishly defended on the game show for basically its entire run, as all the other hosts seemed intent on bashing it while enjoying a few of the games now and then, on the forums, everywhere else. But I loved the thing. I loved Nintendo, I loved its history, and I loved the technology behind it, the philosophy behind it, and I loved the controller. And the memories that I have of that system are also the memories of me transitioning from just a video game player to someone in the industry. My first E3s were filled with playing GameCube games that weren't yet released. Resident Evil 4, Star Fox Assault, which, didn't live up to things, but hey, it's there. It was an amazing time. And it's the last game console that Nintendo made that was a traditional game console. Balls to the wall, as powerful as they could make it, directly competing with everybody on the highest level. Their pivot for the Wii was necessary, and it's brought them amazing success. But oh, do I yearn for the days of the GameCube, for lining up at 5 a.m. with BreakmanX, running through the Target, grabbing those games, and coming home and playing them. Navigating the balls with monkeys in them, through the courses, sucking up ghosts with Luigi, and returning to a time before free-to-play, before private equity buying up everything, before all the game studios getting shuttered. The time that inspired the launch of the game show, and all that led me to.
Hey, what's up? This is BreakmanX.
A system I still play to this very day, that I still love and will always defend, while its sales numbers never ended up matching what it should have. It was a commercial disappointment, but a brilliant machine, a platform of extraordinary creative achievement, the catalyst for Nintendo's greatest strategic reinvention, and the origin of one of competitive gaming's most remarkable communities. It contains multitudes. The purple lunchbox didn't just deserve better, it earned it by being better than anyone gave it credit for, in ways that took years to fully appreciate. And I love that now on the Switch 2, everyone's so excited for GameCube games to come to it and people to enjoy it, a whole new generation of folks. But as Nintendo pointed out, where were y'all in the early 2000s when we could have sold more? If you grew up with a GameCube, I hope this video felt like justice. If you didn't, if you had a PS2 or Xbox, or even nothing at all during that time period, I hope it felt like a discovery. Because this system and what was made for it deserved an audience that the market didn't always provide. Better late than ever. One of our other game show hosts shared her opinion on the GameCube, which was super important to her as well. Let's check out what Jess had to say.
You know, I don't think there's more impactful video game console for me than the GameCube. It was the first one I ever bought with my own money that was solely mine. It didn't exist as like a family console. And honestly, it shaped so much of what I love about gaming. So many of my favorite games were on the GameCube: Animal Crossing, Harvest Moon: A Wonderful Life, Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. But I think the one that had the biggest impact on me was Luigi's Mansion. There was so much that I loved about that game. I was excited for the chance to play as Luigi. He was always one of my favorite characters, and I just thought he had so much personality, and I loved the idea that you had this like terrified, scaredy cat character, but he was gonna buck up and save the day anyway. I thought EGAD was also a wonderful addition. I personally am a big fan of the wacky scientist trope, and I thought he filled that perfectly. And then, of course, we get King Boo, who has become such a staple of the Mario world, and it was so cool to see him for the first time. I know back when it came out, the biggest criticism was that it was sort of a short game, but I honestly don't remember being all that bothered by it. If anything, it just encouraged me to play it that much more and replay it more often. But overall, I mean, it was just such a fun vibe, and I mean, who doesn't want to be a Ghostbuster in the world of Super Mario? But for me, the significance of Luigi's Mansion doesn't just lie in the game itself, it is everything that it led to. I was younger when the game came out, and it was really one of the first experiences that I had with a scary game. Now, of course, as an adult, I'm not going to call Luigi's Mansion a horror game by any stretch of the imagination, but it was one of the first times I got to play a game that had those kind of aspects to it, and I just was completely enthralled. And I remember being so excited anytime anything even vaguely spooky happened. And so playing that game really kind of set me on the path of horror games that I love so much. If I'm remembering correctly, I actually think the next game that I rented after I finished Luigi's Mansion was, in fact, Resident Evil, which has now grown to become one of my favorite game franchises of all time. And it's just kind of crazy to think that if I had not gotten that GameCube and I had not played Luigi's Mansion, who knows if it would have happened that way. And so for all those reasons, Luigi's Mansion is one of my favorite games of all time, and the GameCube is one of my favorite consoles that I've ever had the benefit of playing.
So there I was, November 18th, 2001, like a lot of other Nintendo fans, standing out in the cold with BreakmanX, dying with excitement for a console I could never have anticipated how much of an impact it would have on me. Potentially still the console that has more impact on me than any in history. The money I'd saved, burning a hole in my pocket, couldn't wait to spend it almost more than probably any time in my life. Why was this console so important? Obviously, for me, it was one of the foundations of the game show, because one of the reasons I launched this show was to defend the GameCube from all of the attacks that it was getting on forums and all over the internet. But it wasn't just important for me. Thank you for watching. If this video meant anything to you, please like, subscribe, share it with someone that loved a GameCube, or share it with someone that didn't love a GameCube and frustrate them a little bit. And drop a little comment below and tell me your favorite memory of the system. I do read all of them. And like always, I will see you next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Central on The Game Show.